August 7th, 1942 marked the moment when hell descended upon Guadalcanal. The dense jungle canopy trembled as the first wave of United States Marines crashed onto the volcanic beaches, and in that instant, the Imperial Japanese Army encountered an adversary unlike any they had faced in their conquest across the Pacific. The soldiers of the Rising Sun, who had swept through China, Malaya, and the Philippines with devastating efficiency, suddenly found themselves staring into the eyes of men who refused to break, refused to retreat, and carried within them a savage determination that would haunt Japanese commanders for the remainder of the war. Lieutenant Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood on the opposite shore, binoculars pressed against his weathered face, watching the American landing craft discharge their cargo of Marines onto Tulagi Island. He had fought in Manchuria, witnessed the rape of Nanking, and participated in campaigns where enemy forces crumbled before the Emperor's finest warriors. Yet something in the methodical precision of these Americans unsettled him in ways he could not articulate to his subordinate officers. According to records preserved in the National Archives and documented extensively in Richard Frank's Guadalcanal, the definitive account of the landmark battle, Japanese military intelligence had grossly underestimated not just the numbers, but the fighting spirit of the Marine Corps. The Marines who waded through those tropical waters were products of a unique military tradition. Unlike the conscripted armies of other nations, these men had volunteered for the most demanding service branch in the American military. Their training at Paris Island and Camp Pendleton had been deliberately brutal, designed to forge ordinary civilians into warriors who thrived in chaos. They had endured forced marches that would hospitalize lesser men, engaged in hand-to-hand combat training that bordered on gladiatorial, and absorbed tactical doctrines that emphasized aggression, initiative, and an almost religious devotion to their brothers in arms. The Japanese military doctrine, for all its emphasis on Bushido and the warrior spirit, had been crafted during decades of fighting opponents who could be intimidated, who would surrender when faced with overwhelming force, who valued their lives above their mission objectives. The Chinese forces, despite their courage and numbers, had been hampered by poor equipment, fractured command structures, and limited training. The British and Dutch colonial forces in Southeast Asia had been psychologically defeated before the first shots were fired, demoralized by years of declining imperial power, and unprepared for the ferocity of Japanese assault tactics. But the Marines represented something fundamentally different. They were technological equals, equipped with the M1903 Springfield rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and mortars that matched or exceeded Japanese weaponry. More critically, they possessed a tactical flexibility that Japanese officers found bewildering. Where Japanese doctrine demanded rigid adherence to predetermined plans, Marine training emphasized adaptation and initiative at every command level. A Marine sergeant could make battlefield decisions that would require approval from a Japanese colonel, and this decentralization of authority would prove devastating in the close-quarters jungle warfare that defined the Pacific Campaign. As the sun set on that first day, Colonel Ichiki began drafting his initial reports to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. He carefully chose his words, knowing that admitting the strength of the American forces might be interpreted as cowardice or defeatism. But deep in his warrior's heart, he recognized something terrible. The war had fundamentally changed, and the easy victories were finished forever. September 13th, 1942 brought Colonel Ichiki face to face with the reality he had feared. The Tenaru River, misnamed by American cartographers but destined for historical infamy, became the site where Japanese confidence shattered against Marine firepower. Ichiki had assembled 916 elite soldiers from the 28th Infantry Regiment, veterans who had distinguished themselves in Manchuria and expected another swift triumph. They advanced in the pre-dawn darkness, anticipating the collapse of American resolve under their Banzai Charge, that terrifying wave of humanity and steel that had broken so many defensive lines across Asia. Instead, they encountered a killing zone of such efficiency that it would be studied in military academies for generations. The Marines had established interlocking fields of fire, positioned their machine guns with mathematical precision, and waited with disciplined patience for the Japanese assault. When Ichiki's forces charged across the sandbar, screaming their battle cries and expecting American panic, they instead met a wall of lead so dense that entire ranks disappeared in clouds of red mist. Within minutes, The coconut groves transformed into a charnel house where Japanese bodies piled 3 and 4 deep. What shocked Japanese survivors most profoundly was not merely the firepower, but the cold, tactical ruthlessness with which Marines prosecuted their counterattack. While Japanese military culture emphasized the glorious charge and honorable death in battle, Marine doctrine focused on destruction of enemy combat power through the most efficient means available. When dawn broke and revealed the extent of Japanese casualties, Marine commanders ordered tanks forward to systematically eliminate remaining pockets of resistance. According to documentation preserved by the Marine Corps History Division, only 128 men from Ichiki's regiment survived to retreat into the jungle. The colonel himself, unable to bear the shame of such catastrophic defeat, committed ritual suicide on the battlefield. The news of the Tenaru disaster rippled through Japanese military channels with the force of an earthquake. General Harukichi Hyakutake, commanding the 17th Army, read the after-action reports with mounting disbelief. His staff officers had assured him that American Marines were merely soldiers with different uniforms, that their reputation was propaganda designed to intimidate. The reality documented in survivor testimonies told a different story entirely. One wounded sergeant described how Marines had advanced through heavy fire to flank Japanese positions, how they had methodically cleared bunkers with flamethrowers and grenades, how they had shown no mercy to banzai charges, but also took prisoners when Japanese soldiers surrendered, a practice that confused troops trained to expect execution if captured. The tactical differences between Japanese infantry and Marine Corps doctrine became increasingly apparent with each subsequent engagement. Japanese forces relied heavily on nighttime infiltration tactics, small unit raids designed to spread terror and confusion among defenders. These techniques had proven devastatingly effective against Chinese forces and the colonial troops in Southeast Asia, who often panicked when enemy soldiers appeared within their perimeter during darkness. Marines, however, had trained extensively for night fighting. They established defensive positions with carefully coordinated interlocking sectors, used password systems that changed nightly, and employed illumination rounds and machine gun fire to slaughter infiltrators with ruthless efficiency. Moreover, Marine Corps training emphasized marksmanship to a degree that Japanese forces found almost incomprehensible. Where Japanese infantry training allocated minimal ammunition for live-fire exercises, focusing instead on bayonet drill and spiritual preparation, Marine recruits fired thousands of rounds during training, learning to engage targets at various ranges under diverse conditions. This fundamental difference manifested in casualty ratios that grew increasingly lopsided as the campaign progressed. Japanese soldiers discovered that engaging Marines in firefights was nearly suicidal. The Americans could shoot faster, more accurately, and with devastating effect, even in the chaotic conditions of jungle warfare. By late September, Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific began circulating internal warnings about the particular dangers of engaging Marine units. These confidential assessments, some of which were captured later in the war, and now reside in archives documented by historians such as John Costello in The Pacific War, revealed a growing recognition that Marines represented a qualitatively different challenge than other Allied forces. October 24, 1944, witnessed the beginning of what would become the Japanese military's worst nightmare, crystallized in coral and blood. Peleliu, a tiny island whose name would become synonymous with grinding attrition warfare, demonstrated to Japanese forces that even their most sophisticated defensive preparations could not overcome the brutal efficiency of Marine assault tactics. Major General William Rupertus had promised to secure the island in 4 days, but the reality would stretch to 73 days of combat so vicious that veterans would later claim it surpassed even Iwo Jima in sheer psychological horror. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had transformed Peleliu into a defensive masterpiece, abandoning the failed banzai charges of earlier campaigns in favor of a defense-in-depth strategy that utilized the island's natural cave systems. His 14th Infantry Division had spent months carving defensive positions into the limestone ridges, creating a labyrinth of interconnected tunnels and firing positions that could withstand even battleship bombardment. Nakagawa believed he had created an impregnable fortress where Marines would bleed themselves white against prepared defenses. He was partially correct about the bleeding, but he fundamentally misunderstood the Marine Corps' capacity to adapt and overcome. The 1st Marine Division that assaulted Peleliu's beaches represented the finest fighting force America had yet produced. These were veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, men who had already proven themselves in the crucible of jungle warfare. They brought with them innovations in combined arms tactics that Japanese defenders found overwhelming. Marine Corsair aircraft provided close air support with terrifying precision, dropping napalm and bombs within meters of friendly positions. Sherman tanks, specially modified with flamethrowers, could reduce cave positions to crematoriums. Artillery forward observers accompanied assault platoons, calling down devastating barrages that could be adjusted in seconds rather than minutes. What truly distinguished Marine tactics on Peleliu was their systematic approach to eliminating fortified positions. Where Japanese defensive doctrine assumed that determined defenders in prepared positions could hold indefinitely against superior numbers, Marines developed a methodical process of isolation, reduction, and elimination. They would surround a defensive position, cut off its supply and communication lines, then reduce it using a combination of flamethrowers, demolition charges, and point-blank tank fire. If defenders retreated deeper into cave systems, Marines would seal entrances with bulldozers, entombing hundreds of Japanese soldiers alive. This cold-blooded efficiency, driven by a determination to minimize American casualties while maximizing enemy destruction, horrified Japanese commanders who still clung to notions of honorable warfare. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, provides one of the most harrowing accounts of the Pacific War, described the psychological transformation that combat wrought upon Marines. The idealistic young men who had enlisted to defend democracy became hardened killers who viewed Japanese soldiers not as human beings, but as targets to be eliminated with maximum efficiency and minimum risk. This dehumanization worked both ways. Japanese propaganda had portrayed Americans as soft, decadent materialists who would crumble under the spiritual superiority of Japanese warriors. Instead, they encountered men who fought with a cold fury that seemed almost mechanical in its relentlessness. The Umurbrogol Ridge, which Marines nicknamed Bloody Nose Ridge, became the focal point of this attritional nightmare. For weeks, rifle companies would assault the jagged coral peaks, suffering devastating casualties from Japanese defenders who had perfect fields of fire and seemingly unlimited ammunition. Yet the Marines would return day after day, grinding forward meters at a time, dragging their wounded down the slopes, and then climbing back up to continue the assault. Japanese defenders, who had expected American morale to collapse under such horrific casualties, instead witnessed a determination that bordered on the superhuman. Colonel Nakagawa, trapped in his command bunker deep within the ridge complex, reviewed casualty reports with mounting despair. His carefully constructed defenses were being systematically dismantled, not through any brilliant tactical maneuver but through sheer bloody-minded persistence, backed by overwhelming material superiority. November 1st, 1944, brought a revelation to Japanese military psychologists attempting to understand why their soldiers reported such profound fear when facing Marine units specifically. Dr. Takeo Ishikawa, a psychiatrist attached to Imperial General Headquarters, compiled testimonies from hundreds of wounded soldiers evacuated from various Pacific battlefields. His classified report, discovered among captured documents after the war, revealed disturbing patterns that contradicted every assumption Japanese military doctrine had made about American fighting men. The soldiers described Marines not as individuals, but as a collective hunting entity that operated with frightening coordination. Where Japanese forces expected American units to become disorganized under stress, Marines seemed to grow more efficient and deadly when circumstances became chaotic. One wounded sergeant from Tarawa described watching a Marine squad respond to a hidden machine gun position. Within seconds, without apparent verbal communication, half the squad provided suppressing fire while the other half maneuvered to flank the position. The entire action took less than 30 seconds and resulted in the complete elimination of the Japanese position. This kind of small unit initiative, Ishikawa noted, was precisely what Japanese training suppressed in favor of obedience to orders from superior officers. The psychological impact of Marine combined arms coordination proved equally devastating to Japanese morale. Soldiers reported feeling not that they were fighting men, but rather that they were being processed through an industrial killing system. Marine infantry would pin Japanese positions with rifle fire, while simultaneously calling in artillery, airstrikes, and armor support. The cumulative effect created a sensory overload that shattered the spiritual preparation Japanese soldiers had received. The Bushido Code prepared warriors to face death with dignity, but it offered no guidance for enduring sustained artillery bombardment, followed by flamethrower attacks while corsair fighters strafed overhead. Moreover, Marines demonstrated a level of physical endurance that Japanese commanders found difficult to comprehend, given their propaganda about American softness. Documents preserved in the archives of the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo reveal numerous intelligence reports expressing bewilderment at Marine capabilities. These men could march 20 miles in tropical heat while carrying 60-pound packs, then immediately engage in sustained combat. They seemed immune to the psychological warfare tactics that had proven effective against other Allied forces. Playing recordings of women crying or broadcasting surrender appeals in English only made Marines angry rather than demoralized. The Marine Corps' approach to casualties particularly unnerved Japanese observers. Where Japanese doctrine expected units to break when suffering 20 or 30% casualties, Marine companies would continue fighting effectively, even after losing 50 or 60% of their strength. Corpsmen, the Navy medics attached to Marine units, would brave withering fire to retrieve wounded men, and this absolute commitment to never abandoning fallen comrades created a psychological resilience that Japanese commanders could not counter. Soldiers fighting for the emperor expected to die gloriously in battle, but Marines fought with the certainty that their brothers would move heaven and earth to bring them home, alive or dead. The ritualized aggression of Marine Corps culture also played a significant psychological role. Japanese soldiers were trained to view combat as a spiritual endeavor, but Marines treated it as skilled labor to be executed with professional competence. They personalized their weapons, gave nicknames to enemy positions, and approached killing with a workmanlike attitude that Japanese observers found deeply unsettling. One captured diary entry described watching Marines casually eat rations while discussing the most efficient methods for clearing a bunker system, as if they were mechanics solving a technical problem, rather than warriors engaged in life-or-death combat. Dr. Ishikawa's report concluded with a disturbing assessment that never reached operational commanders before war's end. He argued that Japanese military training had prepared soldiers to fight enemies who operated within familiar psychological parameters, enemies who could be intimidated by displays of fanaticism or broken through sustained pressure. Marines, however, represented a fundamentally alien military culture that interpreted Japanese tactics through a completely different psychological framework. What Japanese commanders intended as inspiring displays of warrior spirit, Marines perceived as tactical stupidity worth punishing with overwhelming firepower. The report recommended fundamental changes to Japanese tactics when engaging Marine forces, including avoiding direct confrontation whenever possible, and focusing on disrupting supply lines rather than engaging in pitched battles. February 19, 1945 presented the Japanese military with what would become the definitive test of their defensive doctrines against Marine assault capabilities. Iwo Jima, that sulfurous volcanic rock positioned strategically between Japan and the Mariana Islands, had been transformed into the most formidable defensive position in military history. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, arguably Japan's finest defensive tactician, had spent months creating a subterranean fortress complex that utilized every lesson learned from previous disasters. He explicitly forbade banzai charges, instead ordering his 21,000 men to exact the maximum possible casualties from American attackers through coordinated defensive fire from mutually supporting positions. Kuribayashi understood Marines better than perhaps any Japanese commander. He had served as a military attaché in the United States and Canada during the 1920s and harbored no illusions about American industrial capacity or fighting spirit. His defensive plan acknowledged Marine tactical superiority and attempted to negate it through terrain advantage and prepared positions. The volcanic rock of Iwo Jima had been carved into 1,600 defensive positions, connected by 11 miles of tunnels. Every beach approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. Artillery pieces were registered on every square meter of the island. Kuribayashi intended to make the Americans pay in blood for every meter of volcanic ash. The three Marine divisions that assaulted Iwo Jima represented the pinnacle of American amphibious warfare capabilities. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine divisions totaled approximately 70,000 men, supported by the largest naval bombardment in Pacific War history. Yet when the first waves hit the beaches on the morning of February 19th, they encountered Kuribayashi's carefully prepared killing zones. The volcanic ash prevented vehicles from gaining traction, channeling Marines into predetermined engagement areas where Japanese artillery and mortars created a hell that defied description. What followed over the next 36 days became the most savage fighting in Marine Corps history. According to official Marine Corps casualty statistics documented in Iwo Jima, Legacy of Valor, by Bill Ross, the Marines suffered 26,000 casualties, including nearly 7,000 killed in action. These numbers represented casualty rates exceeding 30%, losses that would have broken most military organizations. Yet the Marines continued to advance, meter by bloody meter, reducing Kuribayashi's fortress complex through sheer determination and tactical innovation. The fighting on Iwo Jima showcased Marine Corps' evolution into a combined arms force of frightening efficiency. When infantry encountered fortified positions, they would immediately call in support from an integrated system that could deliver firepower from multiple sources within minutes. Naval gunfire from offshore battleships could drop 16-inch shells with surprising accuracy. Close air support from Marine Corsairs, based on escort carriers, provided nearly continuous coverage. Sherman tanks mounting flamethrowers could project burning fuel 50 meters into cave openings. Bangalore torpedoes, demolition charges, and flamethrower teams worked in coordinated assault groups that methodically eliminated each defensive position. Japanese defenders, witnessing this systematic destruction of Kuribayashi's masterpiece defensive plan, reported a growing sense of hopelessness that even their legendary discipline could not entirely suppress. Captured diaries and post-war testimonies revealed soldiers' recognition that they were not engaged in a battle that could be won, but rather in a form of industrial-scale execution. The Marines would isolate sections of the defensive network, then reduce them with a methodical ruthlessness that seemed almost mechanical. When defenders retreated into deeper tunnel complexes, Marines would pump gasoline into the tunnels and ignite it, or use demolition charges to collapse entrances, entombing defenders alive. Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone dominating the southern tip of the island, fell after just 4 days of fighting, a devastating blow to Japanese morale. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag atop the summit would become the most reproduced image in history, but its military significance lay in demonstrating that even the strongest defensive positions could not withstand Marine assault tactics. From Suribachi's heights, artillery observers could direct fire across the entire island, eliminating the concealment that Kuribayashi's plan had depended upon. General Kuribayashi, commanding from his bunker deep within the northern plateau, watched his carefully constructed defense disintegrate under relentless Marine pressure. March 10, 1945, marked a critical juncture when Japanese military analysts finally began comprehending the systematic differences that made Marine Corps units so devastatingly effective. Lieutenant General Yoshijiro Umezu, chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, convened an emergency conference in Tokyo to assess the mounting crisis. Intelligence officers presented findings that contradicted decades of military assumptions, revealing that American Marines did not achieve their victories through superior numbers or equipment alone, but through fundamental differences in training, doctrine, and organizational culture. The Japanese military had operated under the assumption that spiritual preparation and willingness to die for the emperor would overcome material disadvantages. This philosophy had served adequately against opponents who shared similar organizational structures and tactical doctrines. Marines, however, approached warfare from a completely different philosophical foundation. Their training emphasized not spiritual preparation for death, but technical competence in killing. According to analysis published in Edward Drea's In the Service of the Emperor, Japanese officers discovered that Marine privates received more tactical training in their first 6 months than Japanese infantrymen received in their entire service period. The Marine Corps' emphasis on marksmanship particularly baffled Japanese analysts. Where Japanese training allocated perhaps 100 rounds per soldier for live fire practice, Marine recruits fired thousands of rounds, learning to engage targets rapidly at varying ranges under diverse conditions. This fundamental difference manifested in firefights where individual Marines could suppress multiple Japanese positions simultaneously, creating tactical advantages that numbers alone could not explain. The M1 Garand rifle, semi-automatic and capable of sustained rapid fire, multiplied this advantage, allowing Marines to maintain fire superiority even when outnumbered. Furthermore, the Marine Corps' integrated combined arms doctrine represented a revolution in military organization that Japanese forces struggled to counter. Japanese military structure maintained rigid boundaries between infantry, artillery, armor, and air support, with coordination requiring approval through multiple command layers. Marines, conversely, trained all elements to operate as a synchronized whole. Infantry lieutenants could directly request artillery fire or airstrikes, with response times measured in minutes rather than hours. This tactical flexibility meant that every Marine rifle platoon could bring to bear firepower equivalent to an entire Japanese battalion. The role of non-commissioned officers in Marine Corps structure particularly confounded Japanese military culture. In Japanese forces, sergeants and corporals serve primarily as enforcers of officer directives, with minimal authority to make tactical decisions. Marine sergeants and corporals, however, were expected to lead in combat, make tactical decisions, and often assumed command when officers became casualties. This distribution of tactical authority throughout the command structure created a resilience that Japanese forces could not replicate. Destroy a Japanese company commander, and the unit often became paralyzed waiting for orders. Kill a Marine officer, and a sergeant would immediately assume command and continue the mission. The logistical infrastructure supporting Marine operations also played a crucial role that Japanese analysts initially failed to appreciate. American supply chains ensured that Marine units rarely lacked ammunition, food, or medical supplies. Corpsmen could administer blood plasma on the battlefield, dramatically improving survival rates for wounded Marines. Engineers could construct airfields, roads, and supply depots with remarkable speed, allowing Marines to project power deep into Japanese-held territories. Japanese forces, operating at the end of increasingly tenuous supply lines, found themselves outgunned, outmatched, and often simply starving, while Marines maintained fighting effectiveness through superior logistics. Medical care represented another asymmetry that affected both physical and psychological outcomes. Marines knew that wounds were not death sentences, that corpsmen would risk their lives to provide immediate treatment, and that sophisticated medical facilities awaited evacuation. This certainty of care meant wounded Marines often survived injuries that would kill Japanese soldiers, and the knowledge that their comrades would not abandon them created psychological resilience that Japanese forces could not match. Japanese wounded, conversely, often faced neglect or were expected to commit suicide rather than burden their units. Lieutenant General Umezu's conference concluded with a sobering assessment that would influence Japanese defensive planning for the remainder of the war. Marines represented not merely another Allied force, but a qualitatively superior military organization that combined technological advantage with tactical excellence and psychological resilience. April 1, 1945 commenced the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, and would ultimately demonstrate why Japanese forces had come to dread Marine Corps units above all other adversaries. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, brought together more than 180,000 American combat troops, including the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, to seize this strategic island, less than 400 miles from the Japanese home islands. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded approximately 100,000 Japanese defenders who had spent months transforming Okinawa's southern ridges into a defensive network that made even Iwo Jima seem simple by comparison. The initial landings proceeded with surprising ease, a deception that Ushijima had carefully orchestrated. Rather than contest the beaches where American firepower would prove overwhelming, he had withdrawn his forces to the Shuri Line, a complex of fortified ridges and ancient tomb systems in southern Okinawa. Japanese intelligence had correctly assessed that the terrain would negate many of Marine advantages, forcing close-quarters combat in conditions favoring defenders. What Ushijima failed to fully appreciate was the Marine Corps' capacity to adapt its tactics to any battlefield condition, no matter how challenging. The fighting for Sugarloaf Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, and Half Moon Hill became legendary even in the blood-soaked annals of the Pacific War. These interconnected defensive positions, mutually supporting and heavily fortified, represented Japanese defensive doctrine at its most sophisticated. Marines attacking one position would immediately receive flanking fire from adjacent positions, creating a killing zone that inflicted horrific casualties. The 6th Marine Division's assault on Sugarloaf required 11 separate attacks over 10 days, with companies being reduced to platoon strength and platoons to squad strength, yet still continuing to press forward. What distinguished Marine performance during these nightmarish battles was their refusal to accept stalemate. When frontal assaults proved suicidal, they developed infiltration tactics to exploit gaps in Japanese defenses. When Japanese positions proved impervious to standard weapons, Marines improvised solutions, using shaped charges to blow holes through fortified walls, flamethrowers to incinerate defenders in enclosed spaces, and even gasoline drums rolled into cave systems and detonated to clear complex positions. This tactical creativity, combined with absolute unwillingness to accept defeat, created a psychological dynamic that gradually eroded Japanese defensive cohesion. Japanese defenders, even those prepared for death, found the relentless Marine assault psychologically devastating. Days would blend into weeks of continuous combat, with no respite, no relief, and no hope of victory. Marines would attack in the morning, be repulsed with heavy casualties, regroup, and attack again in the afternoon. Overnight, they would bring forward supplies, treat their wounded, and prepare for renewed assaults at dawn. This operational tempo, sustained through superior logistics and troop rotation systems, ground down Japanese defenders who lacked the resources to maintain continuous resistance. The rain that turned Okinawa into a muddy nightmare from late April through May created conditions that should have favored Japanese defenders familiar with the terrain. Instead, Marines adapted with characteristic pragmatism, using tanks as mobile pillboxes in mud too deep for maneuvering, establishing supply routes on roads constructed by Marine engineers working under fire, and continuing operations despite conditions that would have halted conventional forces. Japanese soldiers, witnessing Marines advance through mud that reached their knees while carrying full combat loads, began to question whether these adversaries were entirely human. Corporal Sterling Mace, whose memoir Battleground Pacific provides visceral accounts of Okinawa fighting, described the psychological transformation required to function in such conditions. Marines learned to sleep in water-filled foxholes, to eat cold rations mixed with volcanic ash, to endure artillery bombardment that could last for hours, and then to rise and continue the attack. This capacity to endure inhuman conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness represented perhaps the ultimate expression of Marine Corps training and culture. By late May, the Shuri Line had become untenable for Japanese defenders, not through any brilliant American maneuver, but through sheer attrition imposed by Marine persistence. June 21, 1945, marked the official end of organized resistance on Okinawa, though scattered Japanese holdouts would continue fighting for weeks afterward. The 82-day campaign had cost the Marines over 20,000 casualties, making it the bloodiest battle in Corps history. Yet these horrific losses had been inflicted upon Japanese forces that fought with fanatic desperation, knowing they defended the last barrier before the home islands. The kill ratio remained devastatingly lopsided, with Japanese casualties exceeding 100,000 combatants killed. More significantly, the battle had demonstrated beyond any doubt why Japanese soldiers had come to dread facing Marine units above all other Allied forces. General Mitsuru Ushijima, before committing ritual suicide as American forces closed in on his final command post, composed a final assessment that captured the tragic reality Japanese forces had confronted throughout the Pacific War. His report, preserved among captured documents now housed in the National Archives, acknowledged that Japanese military doctrine had been fundamentally inadequate against an opponent who combined superior technology, tactical flexibility, and psychological resilience in ways that traditional military culture could not counter. The Marines, he wrote, fought not as individuals seeking glory, but as a collective instrument designed solely to destroy enemy combat power through the most efficient means available. The American decision to use atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 prevented the planned invasion of Japan's home islands, Operation Downfall, which would have seen hundreds of thousands of Marines assaulting the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. Japanese military planning documents discovered after the war revealed preparations for a defense that would have dwarfed even Okinawa in scope and savagery. Every soldier, civilian, and schoolchild was to be mobilized for the final defense of the homeland, with casualties estimated in the millions. These plans specifically identified Marine Corps units as the primary threat, allocating the strongest defensive positions and best remaining troops to sectors where Marines were expected to land. The fundamental differences that made Marines so effective against Japanese forces stemmed from philosophical foundations that transcended mere military tactics. Japanese military culture, rooted in feudal traditions and the Bushido Code, emphasized spiritual preparation, obedience to hierarchy, and acceptance of death as the warrior's ultimate honor. This philosophy created soldiers capable of extraordinary courage and self-sacrifice, but proved maladapted to industrial warfare's demands. Marines, conversely, emerged from an American military tradition that emphasized individual initiative, technological innovation, and pragmatic problem-solving. Their training focused not on preparing men to die with honor, but on ensuring they could kill efficiently and survive to fight another day. The Marine Corps' integration of lessons learned from each battle created an organization that evolved continuously throughout the war. Tactics that proved effective on Guadalcanal were refined for Tarawa, improved for Peleliu, and perfected by Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese forces, hamstrung by rigid command structures that discouraged tactical innovation and a culture that interpreted adaptation as weakness, repeatedly employed tactics that Marines had learned to counter. This asymmetry in institutional learning capacity, perhaps more than any other single factor, explained the increasingly lopsided casualty ratios as the war progressed. The psychological impact of facing Marines extended beyond immediate battlefield effects. Japanese soldiers who survived encounters with Marine units returned to their parent organizations, carrying tales that eroded morale and fighting spirit throughout the Imperial Japanese Army. Stories circulated about American warriors who seemed immune to fear, who advanced through machine gun fire as if possessed, who would fight hand-to-hand with a savagery that matched or exceeded anything Japanese troops could deliver. These narratives, spreading through Japanese military units like a contagion, created a psychological dimension to Marine Corps effectiveness that transcended physical combat capabilities. Post-war interviews with Japanese veterans, conducted by historians like Saburo Yanaga, and preserved in oral history projects, reveal consistent themes in their recollections of fighting Marines. They describe encountering an enemy that operated by unfamiliar rules, that valued different things, that approached combat with a cold professionalism that seemed almost inhuman. Where Japanese soldiers fought for emperor, honor, and nation, Marines seemed to fight simply to win, to destroy enemy forces as efficiently as possible, and to protect their fellow Marines. This fundamental difference in motivation created a psychological dynamic that Japanese military culture had no framework to address. The legacy of Marine Corps performance in the Pacific War would reshape American military doctrine for generations to come. The lessons learned about combined arms operations, small unit leadership, and amphibious warfare would influence conflicts from Korea to Vietnam to the Persian Gulf. Japanese military forces, rebuilt after the war under American guidance, would adopt many of the organizational principles that had made Marines so devastatingly effective, abandoning the rigid hierarchies and emphasis on spiritual preparation in favor of tactical flexibility and technological competence. In the final analysis, Japanese forces hated fighting American Marines more than any other unit because Marines represented everything that Japanese military doctrine was unprepared to counter. They were individually trained to a higher standard, organized for tactical flexibility, equipped with superior technology, and supported by logistical and medical systems that maintained fighting effectiveness under conditions that would cripple other forces. Most fundamentally, Marines embodied a military culture that approached warfare as a problem to be solved through innovation, teamwork, and relentless application of violence against enemy forces. This combination of factors created an adversary that Japanese soldiers recognized as qualitatively different from any opponent they had previously encountered, an enemy that would accept any casualties, endure any hardships, and overcome any obstacles to accomplish their mission. That recognition, more than any tactical consideration, explained the unique dread that Japanese forces felt when they learned Marines stood opposite them on the battlefield.